Hi, my name is Ray Gordon. I'm presenting the Afrobarometer, Monopolizing the Definition of Democracy in Africa. I'm from Western Michigan University. Okay, so my outline, I'm going to go over my argument in brief, then I'll talk briefly about my methods, democracy as a contested concept, then I'll introduce the Afrobarometer, particularly how it promotes procedural democracy in a number of ways. Then I'll talk about its origins, funding, and personnel as connected to procedural democracy. Then I'll talk about the implications. So my argument in brief is the Afrobarometer is the preeminent source of data on public perceptions of democracy in Africa. This organization defines democracy procedurally. This definition emphasizes free market capitalism and a limited version of democratic rights for citizens that exclude considerations of social or economic equality. The use of this definition impacts the way survey questions are worded and how results are analyzed and reported. As the predominant source of public opinion data regarding how Africans view democracy, the Afrobarometer thus holds a monopoly on how researchers and governments may understand Africans' perceptions and understandings of democracy. So I further argue that definitions of democracy are not politically neutral, and that the choice to utilize a procedural definition is a political choice. In my view, the choice of definition is influenced by the ideology of the Afrobarometer researchers and personnel, the origins of the organization, and the long history of funding by the US State Department, World Bank, and other neoliberal institutions. So this all has implications for the neutrality with which the Afrobarometer and its data are viewed, particularly regarding how the organization presents African public opinion on democracy. Okay, so my methods and data, I use interpretive methods. My data is predominantly interviews, original USAID Afrobarometer documents, and a lot of secondary research. So we'll start with democracy as a contested concept. There's a couple different definitions of democracy. There's many of them. The ones I'll highlight here. Procedural democracy or polyarchy, coined by Schumpeter and Dahl. We'll go over this in more detail in the next slide. There's mid-range definitions, obviously. These are things like Schmitter and Carl's civilian control of the military. This is usually added to a procedural definition. Then there's substantive or sort of popular definitions of democracy. Whalen is an example. Robinson, we'll talk about him in some detail later on too. But these focus more on the outcomes. Does the system produce equality? Are the things that are created by systems, are the outcomes democratic? Right? And then there's sort of this classical Greek definition, which is ultimately sort of the literal definition of democracy: rule by the people, stresses popular sovereignty, equality, whatnot. And there's many more. Okay, so this is largely from Robinson. What U.S. policymakers generally mean when they say the word democracy is polyarchy. Okay, that's a form of procedural democracy. This is, again, from Schumpeter. What I want to emphasize here is that this is an institutional arrangement. So the definition focuses on methods and procedures, hence the name, for choosing leaders. So democracy is essentially the system, so the rules of the game. Okay, so this is now the sort of hegemonic meaning of democracy. When folks are talking about democracy, generally this is what they. So some of the implications of this definition sort of being the hegemonic one we use today is that it separates the spheres of society. So if democracy is limited to the political system and the political sphere, this means that it's not really touching economic or social concerns. So emphasizing the institutions and procedures of democracy, one of the reasons this became popular, and sadly I don't have time to get into the history of it, but it resolves a contradiction within capitalism, right? So capitalism is going to emphasize the sanctity of private property, which legitimizes inequalities, whereas classical democracy, that sort of Greek version we were looking at earlier, stresses popular sovereignty and human equality. So you can see this inherent contradiction between these two. But if democracy is defined as a set of institutions or procedures, that contradiction is resolved because you can have those procedures as well as inequality, and those two now can go hand in hand. Another political implication of this definition is its connection to the promotion of free market capitalism. So a lot of political scientists such as Huntington, Diamond, Linz, Lipset, etc., have kind of turned right around and said democracy may require free markets, and free markets, vice versa, may require democracy. So these have been conceptually linked. So the promotion of democracy, meaning procedural polyarchy, is a major goal of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus. That's what it's become. So now I'm going to pivot and talk about sort of how the Afrobarometer incorporates this definition, how they use it, and what the implications are. So the Afrobarometer definition of democracy is a pretty classic procedural one, which is an institutionalized competitive electoral regime embedded in a matrix of civil liberties. So one of the ways you see the Afrobarometer sort of promoting procedural democracy is an example like this. Based on some data from 1999 to 2006 interviews done by the Afrobarometer, one of the co-founders writes, Africans, like people in other parts of the world, see democracy in liberal and procedural terms. So the way they got to this conclusion was there was a series of open-ended questions given to people in these surveys. Over the years, there were 3 responses allowed. Bratton based the sentence above on an analysis of the first responses only and came up with his conclusion there. However, there's some contrasting evidence. So a political scientist, the only other one that critically analyzes the Afrobarometer, named Elke Zern, she reanalyzed these very same Afrobarometer surveys and saw that in the survey there was another question asked, which is what set of attributes are essential for a society to be democratic? When she looked at the responses to that question, she found that only in Zimbabwe did respondents rate procedures as equally essential to socioeconomic factors. In fact, in every other country, socioeconomic factors were more essential than procedural ones. So this gives evidence for a totally different understanding of democracy that might be more substantive. Another example of sort of the Afrobarometer promoting a procedural definition is in 2013. Ethiopian responses were removed from the publicly available continent-wide data set that they normally publish. So completely taken out. They're now only accessible by special request. The justification for this removal is that Ethiopians misunderstood the meaning of democracy. So this is what how they kind of made sense of this. The Afrobarometer did in a publication they made about this issue. So Ethiopians had supplied substantive understandings of democracy that emphasized government provision of material goods and services instead of procedures. And so through that, 80% of Ethiopians in the survey evaluated their country as democratic, whereas the Afrobarometer considered Ethiopia to be a non-democracy at the time. And so they basically threw these responses out. So they removed them from the data set, and then Ethiopia was not surveyed again for 7 years. One more example, this is sort of how the procedural definition of democracy shows up in surveys in the wording of questions. So the 2008 surveys asked respondents to rank order 3 scenarios as more or less democratic in order to understand how Africans sort of conceptualize democracy. But these vignettes, as they're called, still only presented procedural options. Okay, so the scenarios were country A has several political parties, free elections, party turnover. Country B, regular elections, no turnover. Country C, regular elections, opposition party is weak, no turnover. As you can see, although this is sort of the goal was to try to figure out what folks thought of democracy by rank ordering these, every single vignette here is still focused on procedures, right? So there's no options such as, for example, I made these up, regular elections and affordable healthcare, and universal education, which might get at a more substantive or sort of economic focused definition. So I think all this begs the question, why does the Afrobarometer seem to actively promote procedural democracy? And I'm going to kind of pull this back to the Afrobarometer origins to sort of look at this. So the Afrobarometer is deeply tied to the U.S. foreign policy apparatus and the Democracy Promotion Project. So it was created in 1999 from a combination of 3 survey research projects that were conducted by the 3 co-founders, who are Bratton, Mattis, and Boati. So they had 3 different projects. I can only get into one today, but each of them was fully or partially funded by USAID and had very explicit goals to educate Africans about how to think about democracy. So the one example I'll get into today is the Zambia Democratic Governance Project. Bratton played a major design role in this project and conducted an attitude survey that would eventually become part of the Afrobarometer when all these merged in 1999. So the project was a $15 million USAID project in the 90s. It entirely overhauled the Zambian political and economic system. The purpose of the project was to promote market-oriented, sustainable, broad-based economic growth through liberalization. And those are Bratton's words from his project assessment. Some of his very own recommendations for this project included things like a massive civic education campaign to educate Zambians about their rights. Zambia had, of course, been conducting their own elections since the 60s. So why they needed to be re-educated about this is a good question. Rewriting the entire country's 8th and 9th grade civics textbooks to remove positive evaluations of African socialism and instill forceful statement of liberal democratic principles in these books, and then to use the U.S. Information Agency, which was the main propaganda arm of the U.S., to train independent Zambian media. So these were all recommendations, and most of them were followed through in the project. Another key to understanding sort of why this emphasis on procedural democracy is taking a look at sort of the Afrobarometer's funding. So the first surveys in 1999 were funded almost entirely by USAID. The top 2022 contributors still for funding are USAID, the European Union, the Swedish International Development Agency, the Foundation to Promote Open Society, and the Hewlett Foundation. Many funders over the years have been forceful advocates of advancing procedural democracy and free market. Okay, so one funder I'd like to highlight here is the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It's a German think tank. It funded the Afrobarometer for at least 7 years, and it describes its mission as committed to peace, freedom, and justice nationally and internationally through political education. We promote and preserve liberal democracy, the social market economy, and the development and consolidation of a consensus on values. So this is a longtime funder of the Afrobarometer. It also has a questionable history in South Africa, financially supporting the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is a conservative party, widely understood to be a puppet of the white apartheid government leading up to the 1994 elections. So that's just one of the Afrobarometer funders. Many of the Afrobarometer personnel are also deeply connected to the U.S. State Department, the World Bank, etc. Others are corporate elites, and they may benefit from democracy being relegated to equality only in the political sphere rather than the economic sphere, or to is conceptually tied to free markets. So I want to highlight a couple of these folks from the Afrobarometer board. So one example is Nozifo January Bardil. On her Afrobarometer bio, she's described as being the former non-executive director of Mercedes-Benz South Africa, non-executive director of the M&T Foundation, Telecommunications Corporation. She also owns her own consulting company. One of the things that is not included on her Afrobarometer bio is that she's a former director of Anglo Gold Ashanti, which is the world's 4th largest gold mining company. This mining company has a long history of human rights abuses. It was named one of the most irresponsible companies in the world, has the worst possible rating from the Ghana EPA. She did work with Anglo Gold as recently as 2019. Someone else I want to highlight is Natasha Kimani. She's also on the Afrobarometer board. She's the regional director of Future Elect, which is a civic education app. Its purpose is to shape the leaders who will shape tomorrow. How they would like to shape them, there might be some clues into who funds Future Elect. This includes Anglo American. This was a British multinational mining company which consolidated with other mining operations in 1998 to become Anglo Gold Ashanti, which we just talked about on the previous slide. Implats, which is a South Africa platinum producer. And once again, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation. You've got Investec, World Economic Forum, Old Mutual, whatnot. My goal here by mentioning these is not to smear Afrobarometer board members, but is rather to suggest that questions about their objectivity are valid, and to further suggest that they might benefit from advancing particular definitions of democracy. Okay, so the implications of all of this. The Afrobarometer's origins and funders are deeply tied to the project of promoting polyarchy. Many Afrobarometer personnel stand to benefit from the promotion of this understanding of democracy. The adoption of polyarchy as the meaning of democracy has serious political implications, such as separating economic, social, and political spheres, alienating democracy from the everyday concerns of ordinary Africans, which might be economic and social as well as political. And the imposition of free market reforms is conceptually tied to democracy. There's also substantial evidence that many Africans do not see democracy in procedural terms. So scholars like Zern, Schaefer, Ock write about this. If so, an external definition is being imposed on them. So in conclusion, this research has important implications for the neutrality with which the Afrobarometer is regarded by social scientists and policymakers today. My goal here is to caution researchers against using survey data as though it originates in a political vacuum. It certainly does not. So thank you very much. That's my presentation. Please feel free to contact me. This paper is a work in progress. I invite your comments, questions, and feedback.